What is Europe up to in the Far East? The European Union says it wants more influence in the Indo-Pacific. But what does it all mean, and where does China fit in? You see, tensions are already high in a region that produces almost 2/3 of global wealth. The European Union says one of its aims is to protect trade routes at sea. But could that only escalate mistrust between Beijing and Brussels? This is Roundtable. Welcome to the programme. I'm David Foster. We are not anti-China, says the European Union, but when it talks of promoting democracy, rule of law and human rights, what does it actually want? The Indo-Pacific region represents 62% of the world's gross domestic product and up to 2/3 of global economic growth. And the European Union has a major stake in the region. The Indo-Pacific is the second largest destination of EU exports and home to 4 of the European Union's 10 largest trading partners. The long-awaited EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific was published last week. The EU's plan focuses on maritime cooperation, security, sustaining stability in the region and facilitating trade. And it says it wants to promote democracy there too, potentially putting it at odds with the dominant power, China. But what does this pivot to Asia mean for the European Union and for the region itself? Well, time for us to begin the discussions. We go first of all to Brussels, and we can welcome Shada Islam, Professor of Europe-Asia Relations at the College of Europe. Then we go to Japan, to Beppu to be precise, where we can see Yoichiro Sato, Professor at Ritsumeikan Asia-Pacific University. And then in Paris, Eva Pejsova from the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy. Eva, let's start with security. What are the main issues in that part of the world at the moment?
Well, that's a very broad question. Of course, we see one of the main trends is kind of China's rising assertiveness and actions that we see in the maritime security realm. Everyone has been speaking about the South China Sea, but of course that's the kind of security hotspots that have been stealing most of the attention because it has a deeply international dimension, because it impacts on the freedom of navigation and eventually on the vital maritime supply chains that are carrying global trade to our households, and it concerns most maritime user states, including the European Union. But of course, that's just one of the issues that are of interest to the European Union. There's so much more that we can talk about from
Indeed, but without the security and without the free passage, an awful lot more is threatened, and we will get onto that in just a moment. Where is the biggest threat coming from?
Well, it's difficult to point fingers. Of course, it comes from different interpretations of some of the values and issues that guide, or principles that guide these the maritime traffic, for instance. But often China is pointed out as being the main culprit here. But it's the overall disbalance, also accentuated in the current U.S.-China rivalry, that exacerbates this security dynamic.
So, Yoichiro, is Japan at all worried by what we're hearing there, that China is maybe one of the principal actors in preventing or potentially preventing the free movement of traffic through these very, very busy sea routes?
Yes, indeed, China factors into many of the security threats perceived by Japan. And in the most immediate neighborhood, China has been challenging Japan's administrative control over the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea. And further down south, China's assertive behavior in the South China Sea is a potential challenge against the freedom of passage through the South China Sea. But also in the Indian Ocean region, the Chinese Navy is becoming more active, and this Indian Ocean region sea lanes actually goes, through the Red Sea passage into the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. So for the European sea trade, this sea lane is extremely important. But here the threat is not necessarily just China, because as we remember, just a couple of weeks ago, the Suez Canal was blocked by a Japanese-owned commercial vessel, and so things of that nature could also threaten the region. But
so there are
the reason
multiple
why
threats, and it's worth considering all of them. Yoichiro, we will hear from your country's Prime Minister on this program in just a moment. But Shada, I want to come to you and ask you this question. This will be for all three of you, but I want to bring you in, Shada, at this particular point and say, is the EU going to be able to prevent or to de-escalate the tensions in the region by what it plans to do?
I think it can, because as the previous speakers have said, the real problem at the moment is the US-China extreme competition. Joe Biden has called it that. They are finding it very difficult to coexist in this broad, big world. Two big powers, great powers they see themselves as. Of course, the US sees itself as an Asia-Pacific power. China sees it as its neighborhood, its region, and is trying to assert its global actorhood there. So the European Union goes into it with its rules-based commitment to multilateralism, and definitely, at least for the moment, and I hope it continues, not anxious to fall into this binary trap. You're either with the US or you're with China, but trying to do its own inclusive, open approach to what happens in the Indo-Pacific. And I think this is going to be important in bringing down tensions. Just like the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, David, the European Union has taken an open and inclusive approach, which means that they're not falling into the trap of having this anti-China bias. And that itself, I think, will bring down tensions with Beijing. Beijing and the European Union have a partnership. I mean, they've called themselves systemic rivals, partners, and also competitors. But there is a strong engagement there. And I think this is going to be very useful in the region, which, as everyone has said, is suffering heavily from this competition between these two great powers. And so they have to cool down.
Sorry to interrupt. So you think the European Union is there and can be an honest broker between two rivals at the moment, rather than an organization that's trying to get the best of both worlds, what it wants from China and what it wants from the United States?
Well, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's what the world is about. You compete, you cooperate, you take the best from where it is on offer. And I think there's nothing wrong in doing that. The European Union, as I said, with the ASEAN countries, is a formidable, let's say, player on the multilateral scene. And when it goes into the Indo-Pacific, it's not just going with a security lens. It's going with an economic and trade lens as well. And this, of course, is what is essential in the Indo-Pacific, which is committed to growth and the global recovery. So the European Union is not just going there with the security in mind. It's going there with economics and beyond.
Okay, we'll come back and we'll look at trade in just a moment, Shada, because I know that's one of your specialities. But Eva, let me come to you first of all. Shada says it's not just about security, but it is also about security. And since, once again, that is your area of expertise, what would the European Union bring to that area in practical terms?
Europe is clearly not a traditional security player in the sense that it does not have a military capability of its own. So when it comes to military deployments, it of course needs to rely on its member states. And there, as you know, we have several member states that are already involved in the area at sea or elsewhere. France, Germany, Netherlands are now planning to deploy their assets. But there is quite a lot of issues that actually can be resolved without using or recoursing to those military means. And I feel that these are the issues that always get overlooked when we just focus on the US-China binary vision and rivalry. Because there's a lot of those transnational security issues which are really a specialty for the European Union. Cybersecurity, other parts of maritime security, crisis prevention, transnational crime, counterterrorism, environmental security, you name it. These are all transnational security threats that really need to be managed and need to be managed by building capacity of the regional actors, making them more resilient, whether it's to build up their law enforcement or enhance maritime domain awareness. But it is also by recommending regulatory measures, for instance. And these are all these nitty-gritty, seemingly boring issues that really need to be done, that are much useful in the cyber domain, in environmental security, talking Paris Convention implementation, for instance, or the EU's leadership in international ocean governance. I mean, these are all the things that do not immediately concern the US-China rivalry, but are heavily impacted by it.
Let's hear from the Japanese Prime Minister right now, and then I'll come to you, Yoichiro.
We also had serious talks on China's influence over the peace and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific and the world at large. We agreed to oppose any attempts to change the status quo by force or coercion in the East and South China Seas, and intimidation of others in the region.
Yoichiro, there we have him talking about coercion, intimidation, and the European Union saying it's going to work on democracy, ending human rights, dealing with child labour. China is not going to necessarily take very kindly to this sort of language.
True, yeah. China resists interference on those, what they think are domestic matters. And but in that sense, I think it's quite significant that Prime Minister Suga did talk about the Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. And Japan is also becoming more vocal against China's behavior in Hong Kong, suppressing the democratic demonstrators and reversing the so-called one country, two systems promise, which China made at the time of returning of Hong Kong back from United Kingdom. So I think Japan is gradually elevating its kind of rhetoric on the value-based, human rights-based principles.
And is this in part because it can see more international partners coming alongside, perhaps just like the European Union, and saying the same thing, that it doesn't feel as isolated as it was? Is that in part what this partnership might do?
No, when it comes to human rights and democracy, Japan was always trailing behind the United States and European members of the Western society, because Japan's economic linkage with China and other undemocratic countries in Southeast Asia, like Thailand and Myanmar, because of this deeper economic linkage and some other, the shared Asian values and experience of development through different paths and all that, Japan has been relatively quieter than the European Union or the United States. But, the tension between the US and China is really rising, and China is threatening Japan, so Japan is becoming more vocal.
You see, this is what I was wondering, whether Japan is now joining a growing international chorus of condemnation. And Shada, let's talk about these values: democracy, human rights, child labor. And we know that China doesn't take very kindly when it feels it's being lectured. What's the danger here?
Well, I think the danger is to make everything to do with human rights and democracy into a geopolitical issue. These are issues, problems, challenges, and violations of human rights in their own track, their own right. And what the Americans are doing, unfortunately, at the moment, and I think this is counterproductive, is they're geopoliticizing their competition, their rivalry with China, and bringing it into the human rights sphere. What's happening in Xinjiang, the actions against Hong Kong, what may or may not happen, I hope does not happen with Taiwan, these are issues in their own right and deserve to be denounced, condemned, condemned and criticized. What is the danger there, David, is that you make politics and geopolitics into human rights, and that, I think, makes things worse and allows countries like China and others to say, look, this is just about competition and rivalry and because of and nothing to do with the reality on the ground. So we have to make sure that we're not very selective in our outrage, and that when we criticize China, we do the same thing about Muslim minorities in other parts of the world, for instance. So this is the danger here. Do not mix geopolitics, rivalry, competition with the true dangers of human rights violations, which need to be condemned everywhere they happen, whenever they happen.
Maybe I'm being a bit cynical here, but I'm wondering whether in condemning China in the way that it has done in the past about the treatment of the Uyghurs, in saying it wants to bring democracy to the region, this is nothing more perhaps than window dressing from the European Union, because it knows it would be damned if it didn't say these things. China expects it perhaps now to say these kind of things, and the two sides will just say, oh, well, that's something we've said, we've got it out of the way, let's get on with business as usual.
Well, it isn't actually, David, it isn't business as usual, because as you know, China and the EU have signed on to a comprehensive agreement on investments. And that was a major breakthrough in EU-China relations, which have been going through a bad spell, as we all know. Now, and China has retaliated against the sanctions, the Magnitsky Act sanctions that the European Union has recently imposed. Now, China's retaliation has been quite disproportionate, and that is impacting very, very much on the European Parliament, because several members of the European Parliament have been targeted as well. So there is going to be an impact unless relations calm down and unless China does make moves to ease and some of the very strong concerns that the European Union has. So it's not business as usual in any way, but we are in a pandemic and we are working and trying to work towards a global economic recovery. Growth rates in China, the recovery is strong. Indo-Pacific is very important for the global economic recovery. So you cannot really disconnect the two. You have to work with an important power such as China, a very important economic giant. And I think that's true even for the United States.
Eva, let me come to you and talk about the practical hardware side of these things. We've seen US ships in the area. I think they called off some naval exercises with Japan, or at least they were suggested, and then they didn't happen. We've seen Indian warships in the region. Are we going to see a host of European countries sending their military hardware to this region?
Well, as I said, France is already present militarily in the region. France is the only now European resident Indo-Pacific power. It has its own territories in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific, and it has its fleets permanently based in the region. So it's quite natural it is there. If we're talking about the South China Sea specifically, France has been deploying routine exercises for the freedom of navigation. It's not called the freedom of navigation operations as opposed to the United States. Since 2016, since 2018, we see a UK naval presence. And as I mentioned, Germany or eventually even the Netherlands are considering deploying their naval assets to the region. Of course, they are doing it in a very nuanced way. It will depend of how exactly these deployments will look like. It may usually involve port calls, which are routine parts of naval diplomacy. But their main message, and I would say even the whole international deployment in the South China Sea, its main value is mostly symbolic. Let's face it. When
but I wonder, will we see them getting at all close to places such as Taiwan, to Hong Kong, which is a little bit touchy when it comes to the United Kingdom at the moment? Or will they just sort of say, look, we're in the region, we'll steer clear of those places?
Well, they're more than welcome to make a port visit in Taiwan. Of course, these are all gestures that will be interpreted and probably perceived not very pleasantly by China. That is to be expected. They will be making port calls in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Japan. They will be probably making exercises and France already do with like-minded partners, be it India, be it Japan, be it the United States. These are very normal behavior and routine actions that you see at sea in normal times. So that's not belligerent in any way.
Okay, Yoichiro, I go on about that there with Eva, because I know you believe that not all European Union countries are in favor of this. They don't all back what is happening. So how likely do you think it is that it could fragment?
Well, I think the individual European countries play different roles with different emphasis and priorities. And I think France is most active in security domains, in the very deep into the western part of the Pacific Ocean, whereas countries like Netherlands, doesn't even own many naval vessels that can be projected this far. So the Netherlands, even if they deploy, it's going to be more symbolic.
So you think it will hold together even though some European countries may not be wholeheartedly backing it?
Well, yeah, true. I mean, some of those smaller European countries, they may go along with a very generalized, European approach to this Indo-Pacific region, but they're going to match it with tangible, deployment or contributions. Whereas individual countries will be very active, like the France and Germany to some degree.
Shada, let me ask you, since you concentrate to a large extent on trade, what is the win-win game in this for both those countries in the Indo-Pacific region, for the European Union, accepting that this doesn't come to some kind of conflict, that it actually all does work out? What's in it for both?
Well, let me just say very quickly, David, it's interesting, isn't it, that none of the European countries have so far said that they want to join this Quad group, that the US, Japan, India, and Australia have set up. And there is a great deal of concern within the region. I know from my friends in Southeast Asia that the Quad could be, in fact, a destabilizing factor in the region, given the continuing competition and anti-China bias that the Quad has. So I think it's quite significant that so far not even France or Britain, which is, of course, European, they're not in the EU, have actually said they're going to join the Quad. And I think it would be a mistake if they did so, unless the Quad changes its tune and becomes a much more inclusive format, if you like. Now,
so is this a counterbalance to that, and there is a potential win-win for both sides, European Union and the region?
Well, I think, all of my Southeast Asian friends say to me, we have enough hard security actors in the region. We don't need more aircraft carriers. What we need is inspiration and markets and economic regulatory frameworks that the European Union can bring, that European business can bring, as a counterweight also, David, to the Belt and Road Initiative that China has. China's economic presence in the region is enormous, is massive. Most of it is recent, but also long-standing, and Japan knows that. The European Union has its own connectivity strategy. And so I think it is a win-win if we can actually put aside all these grievances and rivalries that we have and work together to connect regions and build the infrastructure, the digital infrastructure, the health infrastructure that we need across the world. So there is potential for cooperation, even amidst rivalry with the Chinese on issues that have to do with the global economic recovery and the pandemic. And by the way, finally, President Xi Jinping did make that point at the Boao Forum earlier this week, because he did say, look, we have ideological differences, but let's not start another Cold War. And I think that's a message aimed at the United States, but also, I think, to the European Union. And the European Union, by the way, David, does not want a Cold War. That is very, very clear.
Eva, let me throw this last one at you. It seems from everything that each one of you has said that this is going to be the whirlpool of the world when it comes to the future of trade and security.
This meaning the Indo-Pacific or the
that region?
Well, clearly it is an area, a region that is drawing all the attention and that sort of combines, all the geographical and the normative and the trade and security trends that we see. It's definitely a fascinating time for international relations specialists and commentators because everyone finds its deal in it. If you combine, beyond again the U.S.-China rivalry, if you combine the fragility of the region to let's say climate change, to environmental issues, to natural hazards, if you look at the emergence of new actors, if you look at the emergence of India, if you look at the emergence of these new structures, it is not just Quad, but all these formations that are around. It's definitely
so much to talk about. I wish we had more time. We will come back to it and bring up some of the points that you make there. Listen, thank you, Eva. Thank you, Yoichiro. Thank you very much indeed, Shada, for joining us on this edition of Roundtable. Very good to have your company and your expertise. Wherever you're watching this program, we thank you for taking the time to do so. Come and join us on another occasion if you can. From me, David Foster, from the team, goodbye for now.